Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we want to review a book that is part of the 40 Questions series that Kriegel publishes. And this particular book is 40 Questions on Interpreting the Bible. Today we have with us Aaron Peer from Charter Oak Church in Churubusco, Indiana. Aaron, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
So let's talk about this 40 Questions book.
Sure.
40 Questions on Interpreting the Bible. What is the thesis? I have a suspicion that it's going to be pretty straightforward, but why don't you tell me what the thesis is?
It's a well-named book, yes. 40 questions about interpreting the Bible, and he answers them.
Okay.
And he actually did a video introducing this book on the Cyber Center site that you can look up as well. And he says there that the idea behind the book was to catch first-year seminary students up to speed on what they need to know about the Bible. So he wanted them to have a baseline that he could work from. And he also goes on to say that it can be good for pastors, educated lay people, and people interested in kind of having a baseline of understanding on how to interpret the Bible. So that's kind of his audience is first-year seminary students, pastors, educated lay people.
Okay. So let me ask you this. Is this just going to be 40 questions, one right after the other? Does he segregate them, separate them? How does this book unfold?
Yeah, he lays them out in a pretty intuitive way. He's got 4 sections, so he divides them up into 4 different parts. The first part kind of deals with just your basic bibliology. What is the Bible? What's canon? How is the canon formed? What about are our texts reliable? How do you interpret in basic ways? So just kind of a basic picture of the Bible. The second part kind of dives into some hermeneutics and questions related to interpretation. What's the history behind the Bible? What's the meta-narrative of Scripture? Why are there so many different scholars who disagree? If the Bible is so clear. And what's illumination? What's the Spirit's role? So kind of an interpretation section. And then the third section, he kind of gets into the genres of the Bible. So he talks about some specific Old Testament genres, some specific New Testament genres, and some genres that kind of transcend both Testaments. And just gives some sensitivities on how to interpret each one. And then the final section has to deal with current trends, which is very cool. He kind of talks about theological interpretation of Scripture movement, speech act theory, and views of the end times, and just some debated things and some new movements in biblical interpretation over the past 50 years.
Well, let me ask you, now you've been through seminary, and you've been in the pastorate for a pretty long time, so you're pretty versed in interpreting the Bible for yourself. What spurred you to want to read this book?
I like the 40 Question series as far as just thinking through how to teach things to people. Because they're very basic, they're laid out, and they're very easy to use. I've read the one on elders and deacons, understanding their roles, and it was very instrumental in helping me train my elders and deacons on exactly what their role is. And so when this one came out, I was interested to see what Plummer had to say. I also really like Plummer. I've been to several of his papers at ETS, and I appreciate how he brings the text to the modern world, and I always learn something from him, which I like. Something about what's going on in scholarship that maybe I hadn't been aware of. And so those two things paired together, I like the series, I like the author, and I thought, maybe this can help me teach my people how to interpret the Bible a little better.
When you think about the book itself, and once again, you've got some background, you're coming to this book with some background, some experience. As you think about the book, what stands out in your mind? What did you find to be insightful as you were reading the book?
There are a lot of things that I really enjoyed about this book that I thought, he did a pretty good job with. The first one, I just like how easy it is to use. I like the 40 question setup. A lot of the Bible study books that you find, it's hard to find what you need right away. And so with the 40 question format, you're like, okay, what am I talking about? I want to talk about canon. And so you look up canon, and you can go right to that question, and you can find exactly what you're looking for. I also thought that he dealt with a lot of important concepts that I think believers should know, but often aren't taught to them by pastors. And for instance, he talks about law. How do we interpret the Old Testament law? Even how do we interpret New Testament laws? How do we make sure that we're not picking and choosing which ones we like, which ones we don't like? What's a consistent hermeneutic that we can use in order to interpret law correctly and bring it into our culture today? And it should be something that we all wrestle with, but we don't. A lot of times people just say, well, the Bible says it, I believe it, let's do it. And sometimes you have to decode culture a little bit, and he walks you through that. And the genre sensitivity is always a good thing. People should be aware that you don't interpret a gospel like you interpret an epistle. There are different genre sensitivities that you need, and I think some people just are unaware of that. They read the text very flat way, and so I think that's very helpful. And I also like the current debate part. I think it's helpful, especially for maybe a pastor who went to seminary 20, 30 years ago, and some of these things aren't even on the map yet. And it's just a way, here's a synopsis. This is what people are saying today. This is how people are thinking today, just to catch them up. And so, I mean, all those things I really appreciated about this book.
Well, let me ask you this. And it seems like he's pretty thorough with his questions. Is there anything that stands out that you wish he had addressed?
Yeah, I think, well, the first one, let's start with this. It could be in more depth. I think some of the questions, the answers are pretty simplistic. And I understand you have to keep it to a certain length. You can't make it a huge book. But for instance, the section on New Testament canon, like how was a New Testament canon formed? 4 paragraphs. I think it probably deserved a little bit more space than that. And there are certain things throughout the book that way, like, okay, yeah, you answered the question, but you really didn't give any color or depth to it. And I think a lot of that's just time constraint, space constraint. So I think there could be more depth. Another thing, I think there's a huge elephant in the room that he didn't address. He was very thorough with most things. And, if I just sat there and thought about your question, I was like, okay, he's going to ask me what he didn't include. So what didn't the guy include? I got to figure that one out. Cosmology, which is a huge debate today, Genesis 1 and 2. Age of the earth, how do we interpret that? Is there a specific genre that is? And does that require a certain sensitivity? And I couldn't find that anywhere. Nothing about cosmology or Genesis 1 and 2. So I thought that was lacking. I also think he tends to make dogmatic statements when maybe he shouldn't. For instance, he talks about the head covering for women in 1 Corinthians 11. And then he says his view of it, and then in parentheses he puts the biblical view. And he did that, the same thing when he was talking about women in the church. He said, there's this view, and then there's my view, which is the biblical view. I was like, wow, okay. So it's like, well, maybe in an ecumenical work like this, maybe you shouldn't have brought your viewpoint to that much of a fore where you equate it with the biblical view. And so that's something that maybe he included that I wish that he hadn't.
Okay. How might this book be a help to other pastors? It seems like it was a help to you because you were looking at how can I, help my people interpret the Bible. So you approached it from that angle. And there were strengths and weaknesses, as the case with all books.
Right.
When you think about other people that are in your profession as a pastor, how might this book help them?
Yeah, I think, like I said earlier, especially for pastors who may be out of the game for a while, it is helpful to kind of have just like just a chapter about a particular movement. What is the theological interpretation of Scripture movement? What are these people saying? And it catches them up to date. And so I think for a pastor, those trends at the end of the book can be very helpful. Maybe they're things they didn't know about or don't understand. And Plummer has just this really good way of getting to the heart of it and explaining it in a very simple way. So I think that would help pastors. And I think, also just kind of structuring, maybe an adult Sunday school or Bible fellowship or, an evening study on how to interpret the Bible. I mean, this can give good direction and good material. And he's actually, if you go to his website, I don't have the website on me, but you can watch his video and he talks it up a little bit. And so I did some research, went on his website and looked at a couple of them. And for each question, he has a summary of it, and then he also has just some ways to teach it and some examples and things to use. And so he's made it very user-friendly to use in a church. And I think that's very important. So this isn't just for the pastor to kind of bolster his knowledge, but to really help communicate to his people some basic things about interpreting the Bible.
Okay. Are there other books like this out there?
Yeah, I think there are. I think he has this really good middle ground. As I kind of survey the different books like this, where I think a layperson could understand it pretty well, and I think even pastors and, like I said, first-year seminary students could also get a lot from it. So I think he kind of holds a pretty good middle ground there. But if there are people out there that think maybe this is above my head, there's the classic work by Fee and Stewart, of course, How to Interpret the Bible for All It's Worth. The sequel, How to Interpret the Bible Book by Book. There's also Sproul. R.C. Sproul has a book out. I think it's called Knowing Scripture. I have it right here. It's an even more lay level, and I don't think it goes into near as much depth as would need to be. But I mean, if you find this book too hard to understand, this is a similar work that answers similar types of questions. Now, if you're somebody that thinks, well, maybe this is a little too simplistic for me, and you want to know a little more, there's this series, the Baker series, the the Guides to the New Testament Exegesis. I love this series. It goes into a little bit more depth than Plummer does on any given book of the Bible and genre. And then, of course, Kriegel's got this new series out that I really like, called Interpreting the Letters, or the Exegetical Handbook Guide. And here's yours. So I'll plug yours.
Thank you.
These are really good books, too. They go in a little bit more depth. They're also easy to read, and you kind of go a little deeper into each genre. And so I think these are similar works, but I think, the 40 Questions book, it holds that really good middle ground there where I think it can appeal to a lot of different ranges and audiences.
Well, Aaron, thank you so much for taking some time to introduce us to this book entitled 40 Questions on Interpreting the Bible. And thank you for joining us. And I trust that as you investigate ways to help your people understand the Bible, this might be a book you might consider picking up, or maybe just to refresh yourself on methods of interpretation. But in the meantime, I trust you will have a great day. Thank you.